The Trump administration is blaming North Korea for a massive cyber attack. The White House says Pyongyang is directly responsible for the WannaCry virus that affected hospitals, businesses, and banks worldwide earlier this year. This comes as North Korea rejects Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's offer to talk with the regime without preconditions. The White House says the Lazarus Group is behind the attack. It's a hacking group working on behalf of the North Korean regime, and it's known for conducting the massive hack on Sony Pictures in 2014. Earlier, we talked to Margaret Brennan about the latest in this edition of Privacy Watch.
Well, it was interesting because we were trying to sort of piece together what this administration's policy is and how they will treat similar cyber attacks in the future. But what we heard from Tom Bossert, who is the Homeland Security Advisor here, is that they decided that there is value in simply making this public at this time to make it known that the United States has this high confidence, as do the partner countries that we share intelligence with, that it was an attack orchestrated, directed by the North Korean government. There are a few things in that country that aren't state-controlled, and they made it clear today that they are holding the government of North Korea responsible here for this attack that was on private industry, public health, and institutions really around the world. So it's interesting to see, because the next question, of course, is, well, if this happens the next time, what does that mean? Do cyber attacks constitute an act of war? Do they require retaliation by the United States or other countries? So there are so many questions that actually grow out of this. And from the podium today, Tom Bossert saying, you know, on a policy-wise, they're still trying to figure out where they stand on a few of them. But at least today, they thought there was value in making this public to call for more United Nations implementation of the existing sanctions to cut off North Korea. But he basically said, at least in the U.S. government's position, they don't think North Korea won on this. While they did show they could take out large institutions, hospitals, businesses, schools, computer systems in more than 150 countries, he says they didn't actually make money off of this, but didn't give us a number either way.
I was going to say, with that said, though, they may be able to call out North Korea as the guilty party here, but to say that they hope they stop misbehaving online and really not to have any sanctions in place, what's to stop North Korea from continuing to try to penetrate every country that has a computer? Yeah,
well, he talked about the fact that attribution was sort of the first step in sort of making them accountable, as sort of calling them out, but then beyond calling them out, we didn't really get much about, well, what happens after that? What's step number 2?
Exactly. Some of that may not be able to be made public, but remember, this is something that the last administration, the Obama administration, also had some tough questions to answer when it came to that Sony attack. If you remember that attack on the movie house, the production companies, and that really did caused financial damage to that company. And there were questions about, okay, well, if you're hitting an American company, does that mean you're hitting the American government? What is our policy? Does the U.S. government have to act in this case? And what you heard from Tom Bossert here was basically what they've figured out they can do in the meantime is to try to advise private companies not just to take the initiative themselves, but to show them, to speak to Microsoft, to speak to some of the corporate heads of those Intel companies and say, look, we've found these bugs in your programs, fix them, because if you don't fix them, somebody else is going to exploit them, whether it's a state actor or whether it's just a sort of a criminal group. So that's sort of, in the meantime, how they're trying to manage the problem. But this is such an interesting new open form of warfare and of damage. And it's something that the Trump administration has tried to elevate. They are actually talking a lot more about how to combat cyber terrorism and attacks, but we don't have a lot that can actually be explained to the public. And you heard some of that too here in not being able to really articulate how do you police what's happening online with digital currencies. You probably heard of Bitcoin and some of those other cryptocurrencies. You know, it's one thing to put in a financial sanction that makes your bank down the street stop doing business with somebody else, but how do you regulate this murky space where bad actors and, you know, people just at home can use as a currency in a way that can help to carry out these hack attacks, because that was, in this case, the currency that these hackers tried to ask for payment in, held ransom, though you heard from the White House they didn't actually make a lot of money. So this is a wide open space in terms of warfare.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned that the White House says that they didn't make a lot of money. There are reports out there, sort of there's a huge range as to what it's believed they made anywhere between sort of 50,000 to maybe 150,000. But because it's through bitcoins and bitcoins have fluctuated, it's difficult to trace. But you talked about sort of a murky area. The question that you asked had to do with what constitutes an attack on the state, and whether or not attacking a company like they did with Sony would also be considered an attack on the state, an attack on this country.
And he said that's not where the policy is at this point. But the United States is holding the government of North Korea responsible because they know everything sort of essentially operated there. I thought it was also interesting. There's a good question here about one of the counter hackers here in the United States who I guess is incarcerated at the moment for something, who helped to actually stop this attack. And you heard the White House say, we got lucky on this, but some of it was just we had a sophisticated programmer who identified what the kill switch was. And so now they have to face some questions of how they attempt to prosecute this individual for other crimes, but then he was quite useful in helping to stop this one. And it was interesting to have him acknowledge that from the podium.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting when he was sort of explaining how they were able to track things down, that he never brought up the name of this guy, Marcus Hutchins, which was sort of, he's widely celebrated and then very quickly widely criticized after he was arrested for allegedly creating malware of his own that attacked banks. He says that never happened. I think he was a British sort of programmer, security programmer or whatever, and so now he sits waiting for his own judgment. That's a whole other separate part to this story that is very interesting, Margaret.
It really is, and so I think it's also interesting to have this administration beyond the cyber front start to really lay down this communications strategy of building a broader case against North Korea. Today it was cyber. You often hear about nuclear. In that national security strategy, they laid out biological and chemical threats posed by North Korea. So on the public relations point of view, when it comes to communicating to the public, this White House is going through an effort to lay out a case, whether that's laying out a case for a conclusion of ultimate conflict or one that's going to be resolved through diplomacy. They seem to acknowledge that they need to get the public to be tracking this and either ask for their trust or be able to explain to them the actions that they take on behalf of the American people if it gets to that point of conflict.
Margaret Brennan, thank you so much. Canadian police are